Okay, so much for that taking a minute. All right, where we left off was that Hamilton had come up with an economic plan to try and solve all these problems that we faced as a new country. The problems with not knowing what to tax, where to collect the taxes, how much money to print, how we were going to pay our debts, were we going to reissue the bonds to the people who had collected them over the years, okay? So Hamilton thinks this all through, and he's going to come up with a plan. And you have this handout that lays out for you, it's called Hamilton's Economic Plan, Pros and Cons. And what it does is it lays out to you what his decisions were in this column, why he supported those decisions, and what Jefferson said to counter those decisions, why Jefferson disagreed with those decisions. So let me just talk you through this document real fast, make sure you understand it so you'll be prepared for class, okay? So let's go to the PowerPoint here, and we'll look at these that way, in order. But you have it on your handout, so it's not a big deal. All right, so the first thing he says is we're going to have the federal government pay off our foreign debts and assume the debts of the states. Basically, this is where Hamilton decides that we're going to be a nation that pays its debts. We're going to be a first-rate nation, and that therefore countries can assume that if they loan us money, that we are going to pay it back, and therefore that'll provide for the economic growth and stability of the nation. So not only is the government going to pay off any debts we've made to foreign countries, they're also going to take on the debts of the states. And that way no state will get attacked for being in debt to a foreign country and not paying it back. So here you can see that Hamilton says, hey, the U.S. will build credit and gain legitimacy with foreign nations. We'll be seen as like a first-rate nation that pays its bills. And then secondly, the states won't get attacked due to the failure to repay their debts. So that's Hamilton. Here's Hamilton. He's saying, yay, economic plan. But then we have Jefferson. Okay, Jefferson is the Secretary of the State, but he has a lot of opinions about all of these things also. And, oh, looks like I need to make my Jefferson sticks a little bit smaller so that they actually fit the screen. Here we go. Here's Jefferson. Jefferson has big problems with this plan, mainly because the South, which he represents, he's from Virginia, and he represents the interests of the South. He says, wait a minute. We've already paid our debts. So we don't really see why the federal government should assume the debts of the North, and then the South will be taxed to help pay the debts of the North. So Jefferson sees this in a much different light than Hamilton and thinks that it's really not in his region's interest to pursue that assumption of state debts. Okay? The next thing we have is Hamilton's decision to reissue bonds to the people who hold them and pay them in full when they mature. All right, what this basically comes down to is Hamilton has to make a decision in this case. I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit. Hamilton has to make a decision in this case. He can't make the poor people happy who had the bonds swindled off of them, and make the wealthy people happy who now hold the bonds and hope to benefit from fiscally by having them honored. So Hamilton has to make a calculation. If we're a new nation and we want to last, would we be better suited to make the poor people mad, or be better suited to make the wealthy people mad? Well, he's not an elitist. I mean, Hamilton is a self-made man, after all. But he knows that wealthy people have money and education and can overthrow a new government if you make them mad enough. Whereas poor people, if you make them mad, that's not good, but they don't have the education level or the money to finance a revolution. So Hamilton decides in this bond issue that the best thing to do is to make the wealthy people happy and honor those bonds that they now hold and honor them in full. Okay? So that is Hamilton's idea, is to the government would be supported by the wealthy bondholders who would want the government to succeed so they get paid. Okay? Whereas Jefferson represents the poor people. And here's Jefferson, he's like, no, some people had bought bonds from poor people at a greatly reduced price, and now they're going to be rewarded for swindling the poor people. Okay? So Jefferson's very upset about this. He thinks it kind of rewards the cheaters to the detriment of, or to the disadvantage of, the poor people. Okay? The next thing Hamilton decides is that what we really need to do when we collect taxes and we're going to print money, we need to establish a national bank. Now, this isn't in the Constitution, establishing a national bank. There's nowhere in the Constitution it says that Congress has the power to establish a national bank. But to him it just makes sense. We need a building, a place, where we print money, where we pull in tax money and other government funds and hold it where it'll be secured. He also thinks, hey, while we're getting the wealthy people all invested in the new nation, we could make them like partial investors and like the managers of the bank. and then they would feel important, and they would be tied to the success of the government. They would be making major decisions about the bank and its policies. Well, Jefferson is very cranky about this whole idea. He's like, wait a minute, that's not in the Constitution. Okay, this is the part right here. It's not in the Constitution that we can have a national bank, so therefore Jefferson thinks it's unconstitutional. Also, he's very nervous about this part. He thinks like the rich people are getting like an inside track on running the country, and he fears that what we're going to get is something called plutocracy, or rich rule by the rich. Okay, so Jefferson very much disagrees with the whole establishment of a national bank idea. All right. The next thing that Hamilton decides to do is he needs to raise money, and he thinks it would make sense to tax imported goods. That's goods coming into the country by other nations, being sold by foreign nations. First of all, we're importing a lot. If you remember, the South doesn't have many towns or cities or much manufacturing, so they're importing a lot from Britain, and so we'll make a lot of money, and we need a lot of money because we have a lot of debt. Also, it'll keep people from buying foreign products. It'll make them more likely to buy American-made products in America, and so he thinks that would be a really good idea to help kind of sponsor the growth of U.S.-based business, like Buy American. Jefferson is a real problem with this plan because he's from the South. He says, hey, wait a minute, this is like a Southern tax. Basically, we import more, so we'll have to pay more taxes. And so that's not exactly right, that we have to pay a heavier burden of taxes than the North. So Jefferson doesn't like this import tax idea at all. The next idea is another way to make a whole lot of money is to tax whiskey. It's called a sin tax. This would raise a lot of money, and besides that, since nobody's supposed to be drinking whiskey according to religious kind of teachings, then anyone buying it or using it should be taxed. And Hamilton thought this was a totally legitimate way to raise a lot of needed money. It's kind of like our modern-day cigarette taxes or high alcohol taxes. The idea is that it's a luxury, you don't need it, and therefore it's okay to tax it. Jefferson sees this very differently because he knows that poor farmers who live in the West grow corn, but it's hard to get the corn over the mountains to market without it rotting. So what the poor farmers do in the West is they turn the corn into whiskey, and then they take it over the mountains and they can sell it at a great profit. So if you're taxing whiskey, you're basically taxing poor farmers, and that's what you call a regressive tax. It hurts the poor people more than the rich people. And so Jefferson is very much opposed to the whole whiskey tax. Well, as you can imagine, not only is Jefferson opposed to the whiskey tax, but so are all the poor farmers out in the western part of the country. If you remember, we've talked in the past about East versus West. Poor people in the West are resentful against rich people in the East. Well, in this case, it leads to a rebellion. Some Pennsylvania farmers rebel, and they basically say that they're not going to pay the tax. The governor of Pennsylvania is also unwilling to enforce the law and make them pay the tax. So it's up to Washington to decide, what is he going to do? All right, this is a big, big moment, okay? This is big. This is like the first time that the American people have tested George Washington. It's basically like when you get like a substitute teacher who comes in your classroom and you just aren't quite sure if they're going to be strict or they're going to be lenient, if they're going to be cool, or if they're going to be, all mad, all mean. So this is like Washington getting tested. The American people are testing Washington, and they're basically saying, you know what, we don't like this tax, and some of us aren't going to pay it, and what are you going to do about it? And Washington realizes that this is a really pivotal moment. He gets advice from Hamilton and from Jefferson, and Hamilton says, dude, you got to smush it. You got to show these people that this is a fair tax. It was passed by their representatives in the House of Representatives. It's democracy. It's majority rule. You may not like it, but it's the law of the land, and you have to obey it. Whereas Jefferson's advice is, dude, just change the tax. That's why they're rebelling. It's a really bad tax. And you'd be smart to just realize that and think of another way to make money than taxing poor people, because that's how poor people act when you tax them. If it's an unfair tax, they're right in revolting because it's an unfair tax. So it's up to Washington to decide who's he going to listen to, Hamilton, Jefferson. Here's Washington. Who should I listen to? Hamilton saying, smush him, you gotta get rid of him, you gotta show him who's boss. And Jefferson saying, oh, come on, don't be so strict, it's just a really crappy tax, so just lift the tax, it'll be okay. Well, who does Washington listen to? Hamilton. This is where we get to the point where they're kind of like two sons competing for their father's affection, and they both want Washington to pick their side. and again, this is where Washington is going to side with Hamilton, in this case and many others. And you're going to see why Jefferson increasingly becomes very kind of disaffected, and eventually is going to resign from Washington's cabinet, because he really feels like he doesn't really have a voice in the cabinet, that Washington always picks Hamilton's point of view. Okay? So what the chart here is saying about that is, it's Hamilton's advice to put down tax rebellions with a strong federal force, because it's his idea that people need to know that the federal government can and will enforce federal law, and that tax rebellions will not be tolerated. And so a large military force should be sent out to put down the rebellious farmers. It's Jefferson's idea that the tax was unfair, the tax rebellion is somewhat justified, and the best way to resolve the crisis is just to lift the tax. Okay? The Whiskey Rebellion is put down, and it is clear now in America that if Congress passes a tax, you got to pay your taxes. And that's why in America, when they raise our taxes, we grumble about it, and we're not too happy. But we don't say take to the streets. Whereas there are some countries like France, where you raise those people's taxes, they all go lay down in the streets and have a strike, and a national crisis breaks out. So thanks to Washington, he set an important precedent that in America, the law of the land is the law of the land, and it will be enforced by the president. All right, where we're going to pick up with this in class is we're going to talk about the formation of the two political parties, one led by Hamilton, one led by Jefferson, and then we'll be ready to do a group activity if you have watched this video. So I'm really proud of you for watching this video. Good job.